A stage set for sparks. The October morning was crisp and alive with energy as sunlight reflected off the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan. Inside the sleek ZN studios, however, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Producers hurried through the halls, technical teams whispered frantically into headsets, and the hum of anticipation hung in the air like static electricity. As a longtime member of the studio staff, I had seen my fair share of high-stakes interviews. But this one was different. Today's guest was Melania Trump. After years of relative silence, she had agreed to a rare sit-down interview on one of the network's flagship programs. The host, Karen Mitchell, was known for her sharp wit and confrontational style. She had a reputation for holding nothing back, especially when it came to high-profile political figures. People were already calling this the interview of the year, and everyone in the building knew it could be explosive. I stood in the corner of the bustling control room, sipping my coffee and watching the chaos unfold. Executive producer Mike Cohen was pacing back and forth, barking orders into his headset. Double-check the teleprompters. I don't want any glitches, and make sure security is airtight. We can't afford a single hiccup today. Downstairs, head of security Jack Thompson was briefing his team with military precision. I want every entrance covered and every guest screened. No exceptions. If anyone so much as sneezes out of line, they're out of here. Meanwhile, in her dressing room, Karen Mitchell adjusted her blazer in the mirror, exuding the calm confidence of someone who had been through countless tough interviews. "This is my chance," she said to her producer, Rachel Yang. "Melania is not like the other political figures we've had on. She's a wild card. If I play this right, it'll be a defining moment for the show. And for me." But Karen wasn't the only one preparing for the spotlight. Across town, Melania Trump sat quietly in the back seat of a black SUV, reviewing notes with her assistant, Carla. Her demeanor was calm, almost serene, as if she were heading to a casual meeting rather than a high-stakes interview. "They'll try to provoke me," she said matter-of-factly, glancing at Carla. "That's their job. But I've handled worse." As the car pulled into the underground garage of the studio, the security team snapped into action. Cameras followed every move as Melania stepped out, her expression composed and regal. Despite the frenzy of photographers and staff, she walked with a quiet confidence that seemed to command the room. In the control room, the tension reached a boiling point as the countdown to the live broadcast began. Mike Cohen leaned over to Karen's earpiece. "Remember, we need ratings, but we also need control. Push her, but don't let it go off the rails." Karen smiled to herself as she took her seat on the brightly lit stage. She thrived on moments like this, moments where she could dig deep and put her guest on the defensive. The audience, a carefully vetted mix of professionals and everyday viewers, settled into their seats, buzzing with anticipation. When the countdown hit 0, the lights dimmed and the familiar opening music played. "Good morning," Karen began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Today, we have a very special guest. She's been a model, a businesswoman, and of course, a former First Lady of the United States. Please welcome Melania Trump." The applause was polite but restrained as Melania walked onto the stage. She greeted the audience with a small nod before taking her seat across from Karen. The contrast between the two women was striking. Karen, sharp and animated. Melania, calm and composed. "Mrs. Trump," Karen began, "thank you for joining us today. It's been quite some time since you've given a formal interview. What made you decide to come here today?" Melania folded her hands neatly in her lap. "There is a time to observe and a time to speak," she said, her accent soft but deliberate. "I believe now is the time to share my perspective." Her words were simple, but there was an underlying firmness that made the room sit a little straighter. Karen leaned in slightly, her instincts telling her to push harder. "And what perspective is that?" Melania smiled, a faint but knowing expression. "The truth." The host pushes back. Karen wasn't one to back down. especially not in the face of such a measured response. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge. The truth can mean different things to different people. Let's start with your Be Best initiative. While some praised its intentions, others felt it lacked tangible impact. Do you think it lived up to its promise? The question was carefully worded, almost innocuous on the surface, but loaded with the potential to corner her guest. The audience murmured quietly, sensing the first signs of tension. Melania didn't hesitate. Be Best was never about making headlines, she said. It was about addressing issues that affect children, cyberbullying, opioid addiction, and mental health. The real impact isn't always visible in the media, but it's there in the lives we've touched. Karen nodded, but her expression remained skeptical. But some critics argue that the initiative's reach was limited. How do you respond to that? Melania's gaze didn't waver. Critics often focus on what wasn't done. I focus on what was. If even one child was helped, if even one family felt supported, then it was worth every effort. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Karen glanced at her notes, clearly recalibrating her approach. She wasn't used to guests who could parry her questions so effortlessly. Well, Karen said, her tone shifting slightly. Some would say your silence on other issues during your time in the White House spoke louder than your actions. Do you think you could have done more? The question was sharp, and the audience held its collective breath, waiting to see how Melania would respond. There are many kinds of silence, Melania said, her voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge. There is the silence of choosing one's battles. There is the silence of protecting one's family. And then there is the silence that comes from knowing that sometimes actions speak louder than words. The audience stirred, and I could feel the shift in the room. What had started as a typical interview was quickly becoming something much more. Karen, sensing the tide turning, decided to escalate. But don't you think the public deserves to know more about the person behind the title? Many have accused you of being complicit in your husband's controversies. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed Melania's face. Not anger, but something deeper. Being a public figure does not mean surrendering your humanity, she said. I am not defined by anyone else's actions. I am defined by my own choices, my own values, and my own work. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was genuine. Even Karen seemed momentarily caught off guard, though she quickly regained her composure. I stood in the shadows of the control room, watching it all unfold. For the first time in my career, I wasn't just observing an interview. I was witnessing a moment. And I wasn't alone. The entire room was transfixed, knowing instinctively that something extraordinary was happening. The momentum shifts. Karen Mitchell was known for her sharp instincts, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this interview was slipping away from her. Melania Trump had answered every question with a calm precision that made it impossible to rattle her. The audience, initially hesitant, was now hanging on her every word. Karen decided it was time to up the ante. Mrs. Trump, Karen said, glancing at her notes for effect. Your critics often point out that your Be Best initiative focused heavily on cyberbullying. Yet some say your husband's use of social media contradicts that message. How do you reconcile that? The audience murmured, sensing the direct challenge. This was the question many had been waiting for, the one that would put Melania on the defensive. But instead of flinching, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting Karen's. It's easy to criticize when you're watching from the sidelines, Melania said, her voice measured. My focus has always been on helping children and families. Be Best was never about one person's actions. It was about addressing a larger issue. I chose to lead by example, to show that kindness and strength can coexist. Karen tried to push further. But surely you understand why people question the credibility of the message. Melania cut her off, not with anger, but with the authority of someone who had weathered storms far more intense than this. I understand why people question, she said. But the real question is, what are they doing to make things better? It's easy to point fingers. It's harder to make a difference. The audience erupted into applause. Even the skeptics in the crowd couldn't help but respect the way she turned the conversation around. Karen, for the first time in years, looked unsettled. She glanced toward the control room, where her producer was gesturing wildly, signaling her to pivot. "Let's move on," Karen said, her voice betraying a hint of frustration. "You've been criticized for your lack of public appearances and perceived detachment from political issues. Some say it's because you're out of touch. How do you respond to that?" Melania smiled faintly, and for a moment, there was a warmth in her expression that seemed to disarm everyone in the room. "I choose my battles," she said simply. "I focus on what matters: my family, my work, and the causes that need attention. The noise around me has never been my concern. My concern is the people I can help." The crowd, sensing the sincerity in her words, broke into another round of applause. Karen leaned back in her chair, visibly recalculating. This wasn't going according to plan, and she knew it. Turning the tables, Karen decided it was time for a different tactic. She pulled out a folder containing notes on a recent tell-all book written by a former staffer. "Let's talk about the memoirs and books that have been written about your time in the White House," she said. "Many of them paint you as distant, even cold. One even claims you were unhappy in your role. Is there any truth to that?" Melania's expression didn't change, but her voice took on a sharper edge. "Books written for profit often tell stories that sell, not stories that are true. The people who know me, the people I've worked with, the families I've helped, they know the truth." Karen pressed on. "But don't you think the public deserves to hear your side of the story?" Melania leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "The public doesn't need another story," she said. "They need results. While others write books, I've been working, quietly, because the work isn't about me. It's about the people I serve." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on her every word. Even Karen seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "Do you feel misunderstood then?" she asked. Melania's answer was immediate. "I feel focused. People will believe what they want to believe. My job is not to change their opinions. My job is to stay true to my purpose." The audience erupted into applause once again, and Karen, for all her experience, looked at a loss. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a moment of raw authenticity that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Part 5. The moment that changed everything. Karen decided to try one last question, one that she hoped would steer the conversation back into familiar territory. "Mrs. Trump," she began, "what do you want your legacy to be?" Melania paused for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the room. "I want my legacy to be one of kindness and courage," she said. "I want people to remember that it's possible to lead with grace, to choose strength without sacrificing compassion, and to make a difference without seeking recognition." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Melania wasn't finished. "And I want people to remember this," she said, her voice growing stronger. "That silence is not weakness. It is not ignorance. It is a choice to focus on what matters, to rise above the noise, and to let actions speak louder than words." The audience rose to their feet, the applause thunderous and unrelenting. Even Karen, despite her efforts to maintain control, found herself clapping along with the rest of the room. In the control room, the producers stared at the monitors, stunned into silence. As the applause continued, Melania stood, her presence commanding. She turned to Karen and extended a hand. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice calm and sincere. Karen shook her hand, her usual confidence replaced by something almost like humility. "Thank you for being here," she replied. As Melania walked off the stage, the cameras captured her serene smile and composed demeanor. It was clear to everyone in the room that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. This wasn't just an interview. It was a moment of truth, a rare glimpse of strength and authenticity in a world often consumed by noise. Backstage, I watched as Melania and her team prepared to leave. Her assistant, Carla, turned to her with a look of admiration. "You were incredible out there," she said. Melania smiled faintly. "Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is speak your truth," she said, "even if it's just once." As the doors closed behind her, the studio buzzed with a new energy. Social media was already lighting up, with clips of the interview being shared at lightning speed. But the real impact wasn't in the headlines or the trending hashtags. It was in the conversations that followed, in homes, offices, and schools, where people began to question their assumptions, to look beyond the surface, and to seek the truth for themselves. And in that moment, I realized something. Melania Trump hadn't just changed the narrative. She had reminded us all of the power of authenticity, the importance of staying true to oneself, and the strength it takes to rise above the noise. The interview wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would continue to inspire long after the cameras stopped rolling.